There's an important concept in game design that I, and some of you, are likely intimately familiar with, and it's known as the skill issue. If you've ever noticed that glitches or controller issues only occur when you're the one playing a game, you may also suffer from the dreaded skill issue. All jokes aside though, as games become more mainstream, the incentive to make casual games targeted at broader audiences has grown, and there are of course many reasons to celebrate the increasingly accessible nature of video games. Despite some of these trends however, there's still a large audience for more difficult games. Difficulty is especially common in certain types of online games, where it's normal for there to be a large gap in skill between new and old players. Unfortunately, being bad at multiplayer games, regardless of whether they're competitive or cooperative, is often a truly miserable experience. The amount of toxicity it creates, as well as the feeling of unfairness or the game being rigged, are widespread problems for new players starting more serious games. Some communities seem to be okay with, or even pride themselves in being inaccessible or niche. However, for game designers interested in growing their community, there needs to be some way to ease new players into the game to make it fun to play and learn. Even if we're all ass at video games, it's still important for designers to consider how to make games enjoyable for players of all different skill levels. Of the many ways to achieve this, one of the most important ones is the use of skill floors and skill ceilings. The skill floor is the skill required to pick something up. Failing to meet the skill floor means you don't know how to play your build, class, character, or strategy. A simple and relatively universal example of the difference between high and low skill floors is glass cannon builds or power-ups versus simpler builds. If you're good at dodging attacks in a game like Spider-Man or Rounds, for example, a glass cannon build could be spectacular. However, if you are bad at dodging attacks, having low health would make it easy to die. So a new player who doesn't meet the skill floor of that build would opt for a simpler build with a lower skill floor, like something that merely gives you an ability or buffs your attacks. The skill ceiling is the amount of skill that could potentially go into mastering your build or strategy. Going over the skill ceiling means your extra talent isn't helping or contributing to improved gameplay outcomes. An example of a strategy with a low skill ceiling would be spamming an annoying move in a fighting game. Because spamming isn't that great or sophisticated, you can only do it so much before there's no real room to improve it or master it. However, picking a more complex character and opting for difficult combos would represent playing something with a higher skill ceiling, because practice and mastery can greatly improve gameplay outcomes. Everything in between the skill floor and skill ceiling could be called the skill range, which represents the range of meaningful expressions of skill for a given strategy, outside of which you are either too good to play much better or too bad to play much worse. Since Marvel Rivals is a trending 6v6 shooter with both competitive and cooperative elements, it makes a compelling case study on how skill floors and skill ceilings are crucial in making both skilled and unskilled players enjoy the game. At its best, Rivals encourages players to improve at the game without making the game unplayably difficult for new players. For example, if you are new to shooters like me and have unimpressive aim, you can still contribute to your team by playing a character like Squirrel Girl with bouncing exploding acorns, or auto-aim characters like Scarlet Witch or Cloak and Dagger. These represent characters with a low skill floor, at least in terms of aim accuracy. In theory, the goal of me playing Squirrel Girl or Cloak and Dagger is to learn the core essentials of the game well enough to be able to learn more difficult characters. Of course, no game is perfectly balanced, and depending on when this video is released, there may be various aspects of the current meta that frustrate players. Regardless, the way games like Rivals typically encourage the development of skill is by making characters with more challenging skill floors more rewarding to play, and giving them higher skill ceilings. This means not only that the base benefits of playing a harder character should be higher than those of playing an easy character, but also that the maximum good for a harder character is better. Though it's not immediately obvious, this is deeply connected to the concept of risk and reward in game design. For example, a great Spider-Man player who can avoid death and pick off members of the enemy team can change the course of a game much more significantly than a great Squirrel Girl player can. However, for a beginner to play a difficult character like Spider-Man represents a much greater risk, both of dying when entering enemy territory and of being bullied by their team. This provides players with meaningful gameplay choices that allow them to tailor their progression to both their skill level and personality. This is where we find that game design concepts are interconnected, and games that seem completely unrelated often use similar principles. The idea of risk and reward that makes the strategizing of Balatro so addictive is the same thing that makes competitive games like Rivals fun. The only difference is that in Rivals, instead of betting on a digital dice roll, you're betting on your ability to play well or meet the skill floor. When you're first learning a more difficult yet more rewarding character, the higher skill floor means there's an increased risk of making mistakes and losing. But as you improve, the new skill floor becomes your baseline, and you can learn an even harder, riskier character. Thus, the game allows players to play a safe, easier pick, but once they hit the skill ceiling of that character, it encourages people to grow and learn a more challenging pick. Furthermore, the use of skill ceilings and risk and reward creates small victories and alternating tension and release, both of which are important aspects of game design. First, playing a harder character on ranked can be a scary experience, as you're still unsure of your skill level and how well you'll be able to pick up the new skills needed to play well. However, as you improve, playing becomes more comfortable and natural, rewarding the player with a sense of progression or mastery. While this is a multifaceted issue, balancing done well has the power to transform an annoying, toxic grind into an engaging experience that encourages player development. It shouldn't be forgotten, though, that powerful game design tools can be more damaging than helpful if they are misused. This is especially true with skill floors and balancing, because you're trying to strike an impossible balance of ensuring goated players feel rewarded for their talent, but bad players don't develop major depressive disorder every time they lose. There will inevitably be a trade-off between these two aspects of a game, and the nature of this trade-off and the arrangement of skill floors, skill ceilings, risk, and reward will radically affect the character and accessibility of your game. Accessibility isn't even the only thing to worry about either. Unfortunately, poor usage of skill floors and skill ceilings can also alienate or frustrate skilled players. Guild Wars 2 is a solid MMORPG, and though I haven't played it nearly as long as veterans of the game, I still think much of the praise it receives is deserved. However, I want to talk about a time in the past when arguably poor design of skill floors and risk and reward frustrated many talented players. Without getting too deep in the weeds, after you level up a character, Guild Wars 2 has a lot of group instanced content like raids and fractals, where you have to kill enemies and bosses. When first learning these fights, there are two things new players need to be able to do. First, all or most builds have a rotation and or priority list that you need to know to do adequate DPS or support. Secondly, some bosses have very specific mechanics that you need to learn to progress through the fight, avoid individual death, and most importantly, prevent team wipes. Like many other games, including the game we just discussed, Guild Wars 2 makes it easier for new players to improve by creating builds with lower skill floors. This way, new players can focus on learning the mechanics of a fight while using a build with an easy rotation, and only move on to harder builds later. Unfortunately, a few years ago, this was overdone enough to trigger some backlash. In 2022, a new elite spec called the Mechanist was added in End of Dragons, an expansion for the game. After the rifle was buffed in June, the Mechanist became stupidly strong for the amount of skill it required. The Rifle Mechanist shows us the damage that is caused when skill floors and ceilings aren't properly matched to gameplay outcomes. As I explained with Rivals, the ideal setup is one in which the easier characters are playable and able to contribute to the game, but not quite as game-changing or impactful as the harder characters. However, the Mechanist was very strong and rewarding for virtually no risk or skill. Specifically, the Power Mechanist could easily get decent numbers just by standing there with auto attack, and even better stats with minimal effort. On the positive side, this did make it easier for new players to learn mechanics. The problem is, though, the skill floor was so low and the rewards so disproportionate that there was minimal gameplay incentive to play more complex builds. My friend who played Elementalist, for example, was frustrated because there was little payoff for bringing their challenging, faster-paced rotations into raids, because someone basically just standing there could get comparable numbers. This strongly discourages improvement and progression for everyone. Unskilled players aren't pushed to improve or try learning new things, and skilled players are told that their skill doesn't matter. When trying to provide a low skill floor build as a step up into something challenging, they created a crutch that encourages people not to try. Thankfully, the meta did eventually get better, but not without a lot of unnecessary frustration first. This should serve as a warning of the unintended consequences that balancing decisions can have. To be honest, this type of gameplay dilemma is even visible in Rivals to some extent, because it's almost impossible to get rid of completely. While I think Rivals is a lot of fun, it doesn't take very many low-level quick matches before you run into someone with a problem. Sometimes, when someone playing a harder character repeatedly dies to someone playing an easier character, there can be a lot of toxicity and frustration. When the guy trying to learn Hawkeye loses to the other team's MVP Scarlet Witch, there will often be a crash out that the Scarlet Witch doesn't know how to aim, and is bad, and doesn't deserve to win because they're playing an easy character. Some of this can be chalked up to a massive skill issue, or cope, or the unavoidable toxicity that arises from competitive games, but it also demonstrates the fundamental difficulty with all of these decisions. The more accessible a game becomes, the more frustrated certain people will get if they are beaten by people they perceive to be bad. While the context can make this more or less empathetic or valid, it is something to think about when balancing a game. What may be my favorite way to solve this problem is to treat the anger as not intrinsically bad, but to use it to your advantage. Super Smash Bros. Has probably caused more divorces and breakups than cheating and unfaithfulness have. And at a casual or beginner level, some of that is due to some characters being easy to abuse. You know what I mean. You think you're hot shit on your Donkey Kong main when one of your friends finds some ungodly spam strategy to beat you and ruin your friendship. The naive way to solve this would be to make the game always feel fair by balancing it perfectly. The problem is this is literally impossible. This is because balancing is relative to the skill level of your players. To make the game completely fair, you would have to make every character equally playable to all skill levels and all contexts, and ensure that there's never any cheese or spammy workaround. Not only is this just impractical, it's also unnecessary. Why? Well, think about it this way. What better motivation is there to improve at a game than feeling frustrated at a loss that seems avoidable? For example, my brother and I used to hate it when either of us played Mii Brawler or Bowser, because the other person would always lose to a brain-dead spam strategy. But this, more than anything else, is what encouraged me to improve at shielding and grabbing to avoid humiliating defeat. And though neither of us is good at Smash, a lot of the problem characters from before don't bother us anymore. The frustration from losing was the best incentive to grow. To put it simply, it may be impossible to encourage progression without allowing the player to trip and fall along the way. The challenge then is determining the right mixture of difficulty and accessibility. On one hand, we need reminders that sometimes when we lose at games, it's because we're dog shit. On the other hand, competitive games that are unforgiving and unapproachable push new players away. Games like Rivals do a good job of providing real competition while still providing new players a chance to learn and contribute to their team. But skill floors, like anything else, are a double-edged sword. The wrong choice, like we saw with Guild Wars 2, encourages stagnation, preventing the very outcome skill floors are used to bring about. Despite all this, when wielded carefully, skill floors and ceilings are amazing conceptual tools to aid in balancing games and fine-tuning the player's experience. At their best, Marvel Rivals, Guild Wars 2, and many games alongside them nudge the new player into growth without shoving them to the ground, and elevate the best players without putting them on an unclimbable mountain. I'm interested in what you guys think about all this, and what your favorite and least favorite competitive and cooperative games are. So please let me know in the comments. With that said, this has been Preserved Moment. Please consider subscribing, and thanks for watching.